Settle in, dear listener, and let yourself sink into the softness of this moment. Close your eyes, if you haven't already, and breathe deeply. Tonight, we journey together into a story from the wizarding world, a world of magic and memory, of courage tested not on battlefields, but in the quiet chambers of truth. Let the weight of your day fall away, as we step into a time just after the Great War, when peace was new and fragile, and 3 young people who had saved the world were about to face a different kind of trial altogether. The owl arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the first whispers of autumn were beginning to touch the edges of the wizarding world with gold and amber. Harry Potter sat at the kitchen table in Grimmauld Place, a cup of tea cooling in his hands, watching the steam rise and dissipate, like so many ghosts. The house was quiet, too quiet, perhaps, for a place that had once harboured the headquarters of the Order of the Phoenix. Now, it was simply his, this dark and creaking mansion, and some mornings the silence felt like a companion, while others it pressed against his chest like a physical weight. The tawny owl swept through the open window with official precision, dropping a thick envelope of heavy cream parchment onto the table before departing without waiting for a treat or a reply. Harry stared at the envelope for a long moment, recognizing the deep purple wax seal of the Ministry of Magic, the elaborate W pressed into its surface, the mark of the Wizengamot. His hand trembled only slightly as he broke the seal. Mr. Harry James Potter, you are hereby summoned to appear before a special inquiry of the Wizengamot, convened to examine the events, decisions, and actions undertaken during the period commonly known as the Second Wizarding War, with particular focus on the Horcrux hunt and related activities conducted by yourself, Miss Hermione Jean Granger, and Mr. Ronald Bilious Weasley. This inquiry has been established in the interests of historical record, public understanding, and closure for the many families affected by the war. Your testimony is required by law. The inquiry will commence on the 1st of October at 10 o'clock in the morning. Courtroom 10, Ministry of Magic. Failure to appear will result in legal consequences. Cordially, Tiberius Ogden, Chief Warlock, Special Inquiry Commission. Harry read the letter 3 times, each word sinking deeper into his consciousness like stones into still water. An inquiry. A trial, really, though they hadn't called it that. He thought of all the questions that had swirled around them in the months since Voldemort's defeat, the whispers in Diagon Alley, the pointed articles in the Daily Prophet. The way some people looked at him now with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something that might have been accusation. Why didn't you tell anyone? Why did you keep it secret? Why did so many have to die? He stood slowly, his tea forgotten, and walked to the window. Outside, London sprawled in its ordinary Tuesday morning rhythm, muggles hurrying to work, cars honking, the world spinning on as it always had. They had no idea how close they'd come to darkness, and perhaps that was for the best. But the Wizarding World remembered everything. In a cosy flat above a bookshop in Muggle London, Hermione Granger sat surrounded by stacks of books and parchment, preparing for her NEUTs that she had missed during the war. She had thrown herself into studying with the same fierce determination that had once been devoted to staying alive, to keeping them all alive. The routine helped. The familiar scratch of quill on parchment, the weight of books, the logic of magical theory. These were things she could control, could master could understand. Her own owl, a sleek barn owl she'd named Archimedes, landed on her desk with the same letter, the same summons. Hermione's hands stilled over her arithmancy textbook. She read the words once, twice, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. An inquiry, questions, testimony before the Wizengamot, before the families of the fallen, before Daily Prophet reporters with their acid-dipped quills ready to turn every word into scandal or sainthood. She thought of her parents living in Australia with no memory of her, and felt the familiar twist of guilt and grief. She had restored their memories 3 months ago, had travelled there alone and undone what she had done. But the look in her mother's eyes, the hurt, the confusion, the sense of time stolen, that look haunted her still. And now she would have to explain it, justify it, defend it before strangers who had never had to make such a choice. Her fingers found the edge of the parchment and gripped it tightly. Hermione Granger, who had always believed in rules and truth and doing the right thing, felt a flutter of something she rarely experienced. Fear. Not the fear of death or torture. She had faced those already. This was different. This was the fear of being truly seen, truly judged, and found wanting. She needed to talk to Ron. At the Burrow, Ron Weasley was helping his father repair the Garden Gnome's tunnels, which had been damaged during a particularly enthusiastic de-gnoming session by his youngest nephew. The work was mindless and soothing, his hands in the earth, the September sun warm on his back. He was trying very hard not to think about anything at all. Not the war. Not the nightmares that still woke him some nights. Not the way his mother sometimes looked at him as though checking to make sure he was still whole and real. George was in the workshop, and Ron could hear the occasional bang or fizzle of experimental magic. His brother was working again, creating again, though the laughter that punctuated the inventions was quieter now, more careful, as though George was afraid that too much joy might be disrespectful to the memory of the twin who was gone. Ron's own owl, a rather scruffy creature he'd inherited from Percy, arrived in a flurry of brown feathers, and dropped the ministry letter directly on his head. "Oi!" Ron protested, but the owl had already departed, clearly considering its duty discharged. Arthur looked up from the gnome tunnel he was reinforcing with magic. "What's that, son?" Ron opened the envelope, scanned the contents, and felt his jaw tighten. "It's from the ministry. They're calling an inquiry. About the war. About the Horcrux hunt. Me, Harry, and Hermione have to testify." Arthur's expression shifted into something complex, concern, understanding, and a touch of anger. An inquiry? Now? After everything? Apparently. Ron crumpled the letter slightly in his fist, then forced himself to smooth it out again. "They want to examine our decisions, talk about what happened, answer questions from the families of the dead." Ron thought of Fred, of Lupin and Tonks, of Colin Creevey, who had been so young, too young. He thought of all the people who had fallen at Hogwarts in the battle that had ended the war, and felt the familiar weight press down on his shoulders. Could we have done it differently? Could we have saved more of them? The questions he asked himself in the dark hours of night were about to be asked by the Wizengamot, in public, with the whole wizarding world watching. "I need to see Hermione," he said quietly. Arthur nodded, understanding in his kind eyes. "Go on then. And Ron—" He waited until his son looked at him. You did what you had to do, what you could do. Don't let them make you forget that. But Ron wasn't sure he believed it himself. They met at Grimmauld Place that evening, the three of them, as they had so many times before. But this time there was no mission to plan, no Horcrux to hunt, no immediate danger to face. Just 3 letters, identical in their summons, lying on the kitchen table like accusations. Harry had made tea. He'd gotten quite good at it, actually, in the quiet months of living alone. Hermione sat with her hands wrapped around her cup as though drawing warmth from it, though the evening wasn't particularly cold. Ron paced, unable to sit still, his long frame moving restlessly around the kitchen. "They have a right to ask questions," Hermione said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "People died, families lost loved ones. They deserve to understand why things happened the way they did." "We were 17, Ron said, his voice sharp with frustration. "We were kids trying to destroy pieces of Voldemort's soul with basically no help and no plan. What do they want us to say?" Harry stared into his tea. "They want to know why we didn't tell anyone, why we didn't ask for help, why Dumbledore sent us off on our own with so little information." "Dumbledore's not here to answer for himself," Ron pointed out bitterly. "No," Harry agreed softly. "He's not. So I suppose that falls to us." Silence settled over. The kitchen, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. The Weasley clock that Molly had insisted Harry take, with its hand marked Harry, now pointing steadily to home. Hermione set down her teacup with careful precision. "I've been thinking about what they might ask. They'll want to know about every decision we made, the obliviation of my parents, Ron leaving." She glanced at Ron, and there was no accusation in her eyes, only sadness. The people who helped us, and what happened to them. Dobby, the Malfoy Manor escape, the Battle of Hogwarts itself. Ron stopped pacing and looked at her. "Hermione, when they ask you about your parents, I'll tell them the truth," she said firmly. "I modified their memories and sent them to Australia to keep them safe. I removed myself from their lives completely. And yes, it was terrible, and yes, I regret the pain it caused them, but I would do it again if it meant keeping them alive." Her voice shook slightly on the last words, betraying the emotion beneath the logical facade. Harry reached across the table and took her hand. "We'll face it together," he said quietly, "just like everything else." Ron came to sit down finally, his restless energy settling into something more solid. "They're going to ask me why I left," he said, not looking at either of them. "They're going to want to know how I could abandon you when you needed me most." "You came back," Harry said immediately. "You destroyed a Horcrux. You saved my life." "After I left you alone in a forest being hunted by Death Eaters," Ron countered. "After I let that bloody locket get inside my head and convince me you didn't need me." Hermione's hand found his across the table. "The locket affected all of us. The Wizengamot needs to understand about the Horcruxes, how they worked, what they did to people. We'll make them understand." But even as she said it, Hermione wasn't sure they could make anyone understand who hadn't lived through it. How? Could you explain the weight of a Horcrux to someone who had never felt its malice pressing against their mind? How could you describe the isolation of the hunt, the fear, the exhaustion, the terrible burden of knowledge and responsibility that sat on their shoulders when they were barely old enough to be considered adults? Harry stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening London sky. "They see us as symbols," he said softly. the chosen one, and his faithful companions, heroes who saved the world. They don't see us as three people who were terrified and making things up as we went along, trying desperately not to get everyone killed. But we did get people killed, Ron said, his voice rough. Fred, Lupin, Tonks, Colin, Lavender. They made their own choices, Hermione interrupted, fierce now. They chose to fight. We didn't force anyone to die for us. Didn't we? Harry turned from the window, and his green eyes were haunted. How many people fought because of me? Because I was the symbol, the hope, the boy who lived. The question hung in the air, unanswerable and heavy. Outside, night had fallen completely now, and the London streets were lit with Muggle street lamps and car headlights, ordinary and safe and oblivious. Inside Grimmauld Place, 3 young people sat with the weight of the world on their shoulders once again, different from the weight they'd carried during the war, but no less burdensome. This time, they couldn't fight their way out with wands and spells. This time, they would have to face the truth, all of it, the choices they'd made and the consequences that had followed, and hope that honesty would be enough. The inquiry would begin in 9 days. 9 days to prepare for questions they'd been asking themselves every day since the war ended. 9 days before, they would have to stand before the wizarding world and defend not their victory, but their humanity. Hermione pulled out a fresh roll of parchment and uncapped her ink bottle, with the same determined expression she'd worn when planning the Horcrux hunt. "We should prepare testimony," she said. "Coordinate our accounts. Make sure we're ready for whatever they ask." Ron looked at Harry, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, of how very Hermione it was to face impossible emotional trials with organization and preparation. "All right," Harry agreed, sitting back down at the table. "Let's begin." And so they did, as the night deepened around them, and the old house settled into its familiar creaks and sighs. 3 voices in the darkness, preparing once more to face judgment, to answer for their choices, to defend their right to have been young and scared and imperfect while trying to save the world. The war had tested their courage. The inquiry would test something deeper, their ability to live with what they had done, to forgive themselves for being human, to accept that survival came with questions that might never have satisfactory answers. The morning of the 1st of October arrived with unseasonable cold, as though the world itself had turned sombre for the occasion. Harry stood before the mirror in his bedroom at Grimmauld Place, adjusting his robes, formal dress robes in deep charcoal that Hermione had insisted he purchase for the inquiry. He looked older than his 18 years, he thought. The war had written itself into the lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way his shoulders carried themselves as though always braced for impact. He had barely slept. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he'd seen the courtroom from his 5th year, when he'd been tried for underage magic, the cold stone walls, the shadowy figures of the Wizengamot looming above, Fudge's suspicious face. But this would be different. This wasn't about defending himself against false charges. This was about explaining truths that felt too large and too painful to fit into words. A soft knock on the door announced Hermione's arrival. She let herself in, already dressed in neat navy robes, her hair pulled back in a simple bun that made her look professional and older and somehow more vulnerable all at once. "Ron's downstairs," she said quietly. "The Weasleys came with him. Molly wanted to—" Her voice caught slightly. "She wanted to be here, to support us." Harry nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The kindness of the Weasleys, even now, especially now, felt like both a comfort and an additional weight. They had lost Fred. They would sit in that courtroom and hear questions about whether their son's death could have been prevented, and they would have to watch Ron defend himself against accusations that he hadn't done enough. Together, Harry and Hermione descended the stairs to find the kitchen filled with red-haired Weasleys. Molly immediately pulled Harry into a crushing hug, and he smelled the familiar scent of her, cooking and comfort and home. "You just tell them the truth, dear," she whispered fiercely. "The truth and nothing more. You have nothing to be ashamed of." But Harry wasn't so sure about that. Ron stood by the fireplace, looking pale but determined, dressed in formal robes that Harry recognized as having once belonged to Bill. Arthur had his hand on Ron's shoulder, saying something too quiet for Harry to hear, but whatever it was made Ron nod and straighten his spine. George stood slightly apart from the others, his expression unreadable. When his eyes met Harry's, something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, of loss that couldn't be quantified or explained away. George had lost his twin, his other half, and no inquiry could change that or make it make sense. "Ready?" Arthur asked gently, addressing all three of them. Were they ready? Could anyone be ready for this? "Yes," Hermione said, her voice steadier than Harry felt. "Let's go." They travelled to the ministry by flue, one by one, emerging into the atrium with its high ceilings and its golden fountain, rebuilt now after the war, the old one having been destroyed in the battle that had raged through these very halls. The fountain of magical brethren had been replaced with something simpler, more honest. A memorial listing names. So many names. Harry couldn't help but pause before it, his eyes finding the names he knew. Fred Weasley, Remus Lupin, Nymphadora Tonks, Colin Creevey, Lavender Brown. 50 others he recognized, hundreds more he didn't. All the people who had fallen, whose lives had been cut short by the war. Could we have saved them? The question whispered through his mind like a cold wind. "Harry," Hermione said softly, touching his arm, "we need to go." The corridors of the ministry were crowded, more crowded than Harry had ever seen them. Witches and wizards lined the walls, some silent and respectful, others whispering behind their hands as the trio passed. Harry recognized reporters from the Daily Prophet, their quick quotes quills hovering eagerly. He saw Rita Skeeter, her blonde curls and jeweled glasses catching the light, her expression predatory and pleased. Mr. Potter, how do you feel about the inquiry?" "Miss Granger, is it true you used unforgivable curses during the war?" "Ron, did you really abandon your friends when they needed you most?" The questions came like hexes, and Harry felt Ron tense beside him, felt Hermione's hand slip into his own. Arthur and several members of the Order of the Phoenix, Kingsley Shacklebolt among them, formed a protective barrier around them, guiding them through the crowd toward courtroom 10. The courtroom itself was exactly as Harry remembered from his own trial 5 years ago, but larger somehow, more imposing. The benches rose in tiers on all sides, and they were filled, completely filled, with members of the Wizengamot, in their plum-coloured robes, with ministry officials, with family members of the fallen, with journalists and observers. The air hummed with whispered conversations, with the scratch of quills on parchment, with the weight of expectation. In the centre of the room, where once a single chair had stood, There were now 3 chairs, arranged facing the Chief Warlock's bench. 3 chairs for 3 defendants, though they weren't being called that officially. 3 witnesses, 3 young people who had to answer for saving the world. Tiberius Ogden, the Chief Warlock, was an elderly wizard with a thick white beard and serious eyes. He banged his gavel, and the courtroom fell silent with impressive speed. "This special inquiry of the Wizengamot is now in session," he announced, his voice magically amplified to fill every corner of the vast room. "We are gathered to examine the events of the Second Wizarding War, specifically the actions undertaken by Harry James Potter, Hermione Jean Granger, and Ronald Bilious Weasley during their hunt for Lord Voldemort's Horcruxes." A ripple went through the crowd at Voldemort's name. Even after his defeat, people flinched. "Let it be stated clearly," Ogden continued, "that this is not a criminal trial. These 3 individuals are not accused of crimes. However, in the interest of historical record, public understanding, and closure for the many families affected by the war, this inquiry seeks to understand the decisions made, the actions taken, and the consequences that followed." Harry, Ron, and Hermione took their seats. The chairs were not chained, Harry noted with some relief. They were not prisoners. But they might as well have been, with hundreds of eyes upon them, judging, questioning, waiting. Ogden consulted a piece of parchment before him. "We will begin with opening statements from the Inquiry Commission, followed by initial testimony from Mr. Potter regarding the origins of the Horcrux hunt and the role of Albus Dumbledore in directing these events." A witch stood from the second tier, Griselda Marchbanks, whom Harry recognized as one of his OWL examiners. Her voice was crisp and clear despite her age. "The Wizengamot acknowledges the extraordinary courage shown by these 3 young people during the darkest period of our recent history. However, courage does not exempt one from scrutiny. The question before us is not whether Lord Voldemort was defeated. Clearly, he was. The question is whether the methods used, the secrecy maintained, and the decisions made were necessary, or whether alternative approaches might have saved lives and prevented suffering." She paused, letting her words settle over the courtroom like snow. "We have received testimony from numerous sources, surviving Death Eaters, Order of the Phoenix members, Hogwarts professors, ministry officials, and most importantly, from the families of those who fell. These testimonies raise difficult questions. Why was the Horcrux hunt conducted in secret? Why were qualified adults, trained aurors, and experienced Order members not involved? Why were 3 underage witches and wizards allowed to undertake such a dangerous mission alone?" Harry felt his hands clench on the arms of his chair. He wanted to shout that it hadn't been a choice, that Dumbledore had died before explaining everything, that they'd done the best they could. But he remained silent, waiting. Another wizard stood, a younger man with sharp features and calculating eyes. "Additionally," he said, his tone less sympathetic than Marchbanks's, "we must examine specific incidents. The break-in at Gringotts, which resulted in property damage and endangered goblin lives. The events at Malfoy Manor, which led to the death of a house elf. The Battle of Hogwarts itself, which saw the deaths of over 50 individuals, many of them students." Ron made a sound beside Harry, a sharp intake of breath that might have been protest or pain. The wizard continued relentlessly. "Furthermore, we must address the use of questionable magic by members of this trio. Unforgivable curses. Memory modifications. breaking into the ministry of magic itself. While the ends may justify these means in some philosophical sense, this inquiry must determine whether less extreme measures might have achieved the same result with less collateral damage. Hermione's hand found Harry's beneath the table, her fingers cold and trembling slightly. On his other side, Ron sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly Harry could see the muscle jumping. Ogden raised his hand for silence as murmurs spread through the courtroom. The Inquiry Commission has prepared a comprehensive list of questions, organized chronologically from the death of Albus Dumbledore through the final battle. We will proceed methodically, allowing each witness to provide full testimony and context. He turned his gaze to Harry, and those old eyes were not unkind, but they were unyielding. "Mr. Potter, please stand and approach the testimony stand." Harry stood on legs that felt uncertain, walked to the small podium that had been placed before the Chief Warlock's bench. He faced the assembled Wizengamot, the watching crowd, the floating quills recording every word, every expression. "Mr. Potter," Ogden began, "please describe for this inquiry when and how you first learned of the existence of Horcruxes, and what instructions, if any, you received from Albus Dumbledore regarding their destruction." Harry took a deep breath. This was it. The beginning of laying bare everything they had done, everything they had survived, everything they had lost. "Professor Dumbledore began teaching me about Horcruxes during my 6th year at Hogwarts," he said, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom. "He showed me memories he had collected about Tom Riddle, about how he became Voldemort, about his obsession with immortality." "And did Professor Dumbledore explain what a Horcrux was?" Marchbanks asked. "Yes. A Horcrux is an object in which a person has concealed a fragment of their soul, split through the act of murder. Voldemort had created multiple Horcruxes, making himself nearly impossible to kill permanently." A shudder went through the courtroom. The dark magic involved in creating even one Horcrux was considered among the most evil in existence. That Voldemort had created 7 was almost incomprehensible. "Did Professor Dumbledore tell you how many Horcruxes existed?" "He believed there were 6, plus the piece of soul remaining in Voldemort's body, making 7. Voldemort liked the number 7, considered it the most powerfully magical number." "And what were your instructions regarding these Horcruxes?" Harry hesitated. This was where it became complicated, where the questions that haunted him would begin to surface. "Professor Dumbledore died before he could tell me everything," Harry said carefully. "He had only shown me memories, taught me to understand Voldemort's mind, his patterns. We had destroyed one Horcrux together, a ring that had belonged to Voldemort's grandfather. But Dumbledore died that night on the Astronomy Tower, killed by Severus Snape." The name caused another ripple of reaction. Snape's true loyalty was now known. The memories he had given Harry before his own death had revealed everything, but the complexity of his role still caused confusion and debate. "So you were left with incomplete information and no adult guidance?" the sharp-featured wizard asked, his tone suggesting criticism. "I had Hermione and Ron," Harry said firmly, "and we had some idea of what the Horcruxes might be, based on what Dumbledore had taught me. A diary, which I'd already destroyed in my 2nd year, though I didn't know what it was at the time. The ring. A locket that had belonged to Salazar Slytherin. A cup that had belonged to Helga Hufflepuff, something of Ravenclaw's. And Nagini, Voldemort's snake." "Why didn't you inform the Order of the Phoenix of this information?" Marchbanks asked. Surely experienced witches and wizards could have assisted in locating and destroying these objects. This was the question Harry had asked himself 1,000 times in the quiet hours of sleepless nights. Dumbledore had told me the quest was mine, he said slowly. He had made me promise not to tell anyone except Ron and Hermione. He believed... Harry paused, choosing his words carefully. He believed that Voldemort had protections in place, that if too many people knew about the Horcruxes, Voldemort would sense it and hide them more carefully, and he believed that I had insights into Voldemort's mind that others didn't have. Because of your connection to him, Ogden said quietly. The connection formed when he tried to kill you as an infant. Yes. A connection that caused you pain, that allowed Voldemort to plant false visions in your mind, that nearly got your godfather killed, the sharp-featured wizard interjected. Was this truly an asset worth the cost of secrecy? Harry felt anger flare in his chest. Sirius's death was my fault, he said, his voice hard. I take responsibility for that. But the connection to Voldemort was also what allowed us to understand where he might have hidden the Horcruxes, what might be important to him. Let us move forward chronologically, Ogden said, steering the questioning. After Professor Dumbledore's death, when did you decide to begin the hunt for the remaining Horcruxes? Immediately, Harry said. We left Hogwarts after the funeral. We knew Voldemort was growing stronger, that the Ministry would fall, which it did that summer. We knew we didn't have time to waste. You were 17 years old, Marchbanks said, and there was something like sorrow in her voice. Children, really, and you took on this burden alone? We weren't alone, Harry said, looking past the Wizengamot to where Molly and Arthur sat in the gallery, where George sat with his arms crossed, where Hermione's parents, recently returned from Australia, watched with confused concern. We had each other, and we had people who helped us, even if they didn't know the full story. People who risked everything. People who died, the sharp-featured wizard said bluntly. Which brings us to the central question of this inquiry, Mr. Potter. Given the cost in lives, given the suffering endured by you and your companions, given the danger you placed yourselves and others in, was the secrecy necessary? Or were you 3 children playing at being heroes, too proud or too foolish to ask for help? The courtroom erupted in noise, protests from the Weasleys, sharp intakes of breath from the gallery, the scratch of quills accelerating. Harry stood very still, feeling the weight of the accusation settle over him like a heavy cloak. Were we playing at heroes? Were we too proud to ask for help? He thought of Dobby's body on the beach at Shell Cottage. He thought of the screams from Malfoy Manor, of Hermione's anguish. He thought of Ron's face when he'd left them, convinced he wasn't needed. He thought of all the people who had died at Hogwarts, fighting for a cause they'd believed in. No, he said finally, his voice quiet, but carrying through the now silent courtroom. We weren't playing. We were terrified. We were exhausted. We made mistakes. So many mistakes. But we did what we believed Dumbledore wanted us to do, what we believed was necessary to stop Voldemort. And we lived with the consequences every single day. Ogden studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. We will take a brief recess, he announced. When we return, we will continue with Mr. Potter's testimony regarding the specific events of the Horcrux hunt. The gavel banged, echoing through the courtroom like a final judgment. Harry walked back to his seat on shaking legs, feeling the eyes of the wizarding world upon him, feeling the weight of questions that had no good answers. Ron and Hermione stood as he approached, and without words they came together in a brief, tight embrace. The three of them, as they had been through everything. "It's going to get worse," Hermione whispered. "I know," Harry replied. And outside the courtroom windows, clouds gathered over London, heavy with the promise of rain, as though the sky itself wept for what was to come. The second day of the inquiry dawned grey and drizzling, the kind of persistent rain that seemed to settle into one's bones and refuse to leave. Hermione stood at the window of her flat, watching water streak down the glass, and thought about her parents. They were here, in London. They had travelled from Australia at the Wizengamot's request, or perhaps it had been more than a request, more like a summons. She had seen them briefly the evening before, an awkward cup of tea in a ministry conference room with an official present, as though they couldn't be trusted alone together. Her mother had looked at her with eyes that held love and hurt in equal measure, and her father had been quiet, too quiet, the way he got when he was deeply troubled. "We'll be in the gallery," her mother had said. "We want to understand, Hermione. We need to understand why you felt you had to erase us." The word hung between them like a curse. Erase. As though Hermione had simply removed them from existence, when really she had done something far more complicated, and perhaps more cruel. She had let them exist, but without her, without the knowledge of the daughter they had raised and loved. Hermione pressed her forehead against the cool glass and let herself remember that day, the day she had stood in her childhood home and systematically removed every trace of herself from her parents' minds. She had been so clinical about it, so methodical, because if she had let herself feel it fully, she would never have been able to do it. And it had needed to be done. Hadn't it? A soft knock at the door announced Ron's arrival. He let himself in with the key she'd given him, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the cafe below, and looking rumpled and worried. "Morning," he said quietly, handing her one of the cups. "You sleep at all?" "Some," she lied. In truth, she'd lain awake replaying memories. Her childhood, her parents' pride when her Hogwarts letter arrived, their confusion about the magical world they couldn't fully understand, their fear during the war years when she'd come home for holidays with new scars and old nightmares. Ron sat on the arm of her sofa, watching her with those blue eyes that saw more than people gave him credit for. "Hermione, whatever they ask today, whatever anyone says, you did what you had to do. You saved their lives." Did I? The question came out sharper than she'd intended. Or did I just make it easier for myself, not having to worry about them while we were hunting Horcruxes, not having them as a weakness Voldemort could exploit? "Don't," Ron said firmly. "Don't do that to yourself. You made an impossible choice, and it was the right one, even if it hurts." But Hermione wasn't sure there had been a right choice, only terrible options, and she'd picked one and lived with it. The courtroom was just as full as the previous day, but the atmosphere felt different somehow. More tense, more personal. Hermione walked to her seat between Harry and Ron, acutely aware of her parents sitting in the gallery 3 rows back. She didn't look at them. She wasn't sure she could bear to. Tiberius Ogden called the session to order, his expression grave. "Today we will hear testimony from Miss Hermione Jean Granger regarding her actions during the war. with particular focus on her modification of her parents' memories and her role in planning and executing the Horcrux hunt. He paused, glancing toward the gallery where the Grangers sat. I want to acknowledge the difficulty of these proceedings for all involved. However, the pursuit of truth sometimes requires us to examine our most painful choices. Hermione stood and walked to the testimony stand, her hands clasped in front of her to keep them from shaking. She wore simple robes in deep burgundy, her hair neatly arranged, every inch the serious young woman who had spent 7 years being the cleverest student Hogwarts had seen in decades. But she didn't feel clever now. She felt small and frightened and desperately sad. Griselda Marchbanks stood to begin the questioning, her lined face showing something like sympathy. Miss Granger, would you please explain to this inquiry when and why you decided to modify your parents' memories? Hermione took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts with the same precision she'd once used to organize study schedules and research notes. It was the summer before what would have been my 7th year at Hogwarts, she began, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. July of 1997. The war was escalating rapidly. The Ministry was about to fall. We knew it, even if the official channels didn't. Muggle-born witches and wizards were already being targeted. And you believed your parents were in danger? Marchbanks asked gently. I knew they were, Hermione corrected. I'm Muggle-born. My parents are completely non-magical. If Death Eaters wanted to hurt me, to use me as leverage, the easiest way would be to threaten them. And my parents couldn't defend themselves against magic. They couldn't even see it coming. A wizard from the 2nd tier leaned forward. Someone Hermione didn't recognize, middle-aged, with a bureaucratic air. But surely there were protective measures that could have been taken. Safe houses, concealment charms, protection by order of the Phoenix members? There were, Hermione agreed, but none of them were foolproof. The Fidelius charm requires a secret keeper, and anyone can be broken under torture or Imperius. Safe houses can be found, guards can be overpowered. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. And I was about to disappear. Harry, Ron, and I were about to leave to hunt Horcruxes, and we didn't know how long we'd be gone, or if we'd come back at all. I couldn't ask my parents to spend months or years in hiding, wondering if I was alive or dead, making themselves targets just by being connected to me. So you decided to remove that connection, the bureaucratic wizard said, his tone neutral but somehow accusatory. You chose to erase yourself from their lives entirely. Yes. The word came out more forcefully than Hermione had intended. So I modified their memories to make them believe they were Wendell and Monica Wilkins, that they'd always wanted to live in Australia, that they had no daughter. I gave them new identities, new dreams, a new life far away from the war. Her mother's sharp intake of breath was audible, even from 3 rows back. Hermione's hands tightened on the podium, but she didn't look back. Did you have their permission for this? Marchbanks asked quietly. No. Hermione's voice was barely above a whisper now. I didn't. They wouldn't have agreed if I'd asked. My mother would have wanted to fight, to stay, to help somehow, and that would have gotten them killed. So you took away their choice, the bureaucratic wizard stated. You decided, at 17 years old, that you knew better than your own parents what was best for them. The accusation hung in the air, and Hermione felt it like a physical blow. Because wasn't that exactly what she'd done? Hadn't she played God with her parents' minds, their memories, their entire sense of self? I took away their choice to protect them, she said, her voice trembling now, despite her efforts to control it. And yes, I made that decision alone. And yes, I was only 17, but I was also the only person in that house who understood what was coming, the only one who knew what Death Eaters did to the families of Muggle-borns. She paused, gathering herself. You want to judge me for that choice? Fine. I've been judging myself for it every day since I made it. But I will not apologize for keeping my parents alive. A woman stood from the third tier, older, with kind eyes and grey hair pulled back in a bun. Miss Granger, I'm curious about the technical aspects of what you did. Memory modification is extremely advanced magic, and permanent modification even more so. Where did you learn to perform such complex charms? This question was easier, less emotionally fraught. Hermione latched onto it like a lifeline. I researched it extensively, she said, some of her natural confidence returning. Memory charms are covered in standard defensive magic texts, but long-term modification requires more specialized knowledge. I studied Gilderoy Lockhart's techniques. Several people in the courtroom made sounds of disgust at the mention of Lockhart, the fraudulent professor who had erased countless people's memories to steal their achievements. Not to emulate his ethics, obviously, Hermione continued, but to understand the mechanics. I also consulted restricted section, books on memory magic, identity transfiguration theory, and psychological preservation charms. The goal wasn't just to remove their memories of me, but to create a coherent new identity that would feel real and natural to them. And did it work? The woman asked. Yes, Hermione said quietly. Too well. When I found them in Australia after the war, after Voldemort was defeated, they truly believed they were Wendell and Monica Wilkins. They had no memory of me, no memory of their life in England, no memory of having a daughter. But you restored their memories, Marchbanks asked. I did. In May, 3 months after the battle, I travelled to Australia and reversed the modifications. Hermione's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. The restoration process is complicated, traumatic even. Their minds had to reconcile 2 sets of memories, 2 identities, months of missing time, and the emotional impact. She finally allowed herself to look back at her parents. Her mother was crying silently, her father's arm around her shoulders. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and in that moment Hermione saw everything. The love that had never faded, the hurt that still lingered, the complicated tangle of forgiveness and grief. They remember now, Hermione said, turning back to the Wizengamot. They remember everything, their real lives and the false ones I gave them. But I can't give them back the time we lost. I can't undo the violation of modifying their minds without their consent. All I can do is live with what I did, and hope they can forgive me. The sharp-featured wizard from the previous day stood abruptly. This inquiry has heard testimony from several experts on memory magic and mind healing. They've stated that what you did carries serious ethical concerns, Miss Granger. Memory modification, particularly without consent, is considered a form of mental assault in some jurisdictions. Some have compared it to the imperious curse, taking away a person's agency, their free will. Hermione felt her cheeks flush with anger and shame. I am well aware of the ethical implications of what I did, she said, her voice sharp. I studied them extensively before I made the decision. But the alternative was leaving my parents vulnerable to actual assault, to torture, to murder, to being used as hostages to control me. I chose the lesser evil. Did you? The wizard challenged. Or did you simply choose the option that made your mission easier? That removed an emotional complication from your Horcrux hunt? Ron half rose from his seat, his face flushed with anger, but Harry put a hand on his arm. Hermione saw the exchange and felt a surge of gratitude mixed with despair. Even now, they wanted to protect her. But this was her testimony to give, her choice to defend. My parents' safety was never a complication, she said coldly. It was a responsibility I took seriously. And yes, knowing they were safe and far from. The war did allow me to focus on the hunt, without the constant terror that they were being tortured for information I might have shared with them. But that doesn't make it selfish, it makes it strategic. Strategic, the wizard repeated, his tone making the word sound ugly. Is that how you viewed the entire war? As a strategic exercise where people's minds and autonomy were acceptable casualties? That's not what I said. But isn't it what you did? You modified your parents' memories. According to testimony we've received, you also used various charms and hexes during the Horcrux hunt, some of them quite dark. You broke into Gringotts. To stop Voldemort. Hermione's voice rose, her composure finally cracking. Everything we did, every choice we made, every line we crossed, it was to stop a genocidal dark wizard who was murdering innocent people every single day. Do you think I wanted to erase my parents' memories? Do you think I enjoyed it? It was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I did it crying, and I've had nightmares about it ever since. The courtroom was utterly silent. Hermione stood at the podium, breathing hard, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, wouldn't show weakness, but the dam had broken. I was 17 years old, she said, her voice breaking. I was terrified, and I loved my parents more than anything in the world, so I did the only thing I could think of to keep them alive. If that makes me a monster in your eyes, then so be it. But my parents are alive to sit in this courtroom and judge me themselves, which is more than can be said for the parents of every Muggle-born child who was murdered by Death Eaters. Ogden raised his hand for silence as murmurs spread through the gallery. Miss Granger, I think we all understand the impossible position you were in. However, this inquiry must examine not just your intentions, but your methods. Can you help us understand? At what point did you decide that the ends justified these particular means? Hermione wiped her eyes with shaking hands. There was no single moment, she said quietly. It was gradual. Every day of that year, we heard about more deaths, more disappearances. Every day the ministry became more corrupt, more dangerous. By the time I modified my parents' memories, the question wasn't whether I had the right to do it. The question was whether I could live with myself if I didn't. And they died because of me. She paused, gathering herself. People want to believe there are clear lines between right and wrong, between heroic choices and terrible ones. But war doesn't work that way. War is messy and complicated and full of choices where every option hurts someone. I chose the hurt I could live with. Marchbank stood again, her expression thoughtful. Miss Granger, you've mentioned several times that you researched the memory modification extensively. Did you also research the reversal process before you performed the initial charm? Yes, Hermione said. I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't believed it could be undone. I left myself markers, I suppose. Ways to track them, ways to reverse the process. I always intended to restore their memories if we survived. And yet, you waited 3 months after the war ended, the bureaucratic wizard pointed out. Why the delay? Hermione's hands clenched on the podium. Because I was terrified, she admitted. Because I didn't know if they would forgive me. Because part of me wondered if they were happier as Wendell and Monica Wilkins, without the knowledge of magic and war and a daughter who had put them through so much. But you did restore their memories eventually, Marchbanks said gently. What changed? Ron convinced me to, Hermione said, glancing back at him. He said that my parents deserved the truth, deserved the choice I'd taken from them originally. He said they deserved to decide for themselves whether to forgive me or not. Ron's ears were red, but he met her gaze steadily, and something warm and painful squeezed Hermione's chest. And have they? The kind-eyed woman asked. Forgiven you? Hermione turned to look at her parents fully for the first time since her testimony began. Her mother was still crying, but she nodded. A small, definite nod. Her father's expression was complicated, but when Hermione met his eyes, he gave her the smallest of smiles. We're working on it, Hermione said, her voice thick with emotion. They're here, which is more than I deserve. They're trying to understand, and I'm trying to explain, and we're finding our way back to each other. Ogden consulted his notes, then looked up at Hermione with something like compassion. I think we have sufficient testimony on this matter for now. Miss Granger, you may step down. We'll take a brief recess before continuing with questions about your role in planning the Horcrux hunt itself. Hermione walked back to her seat, trembling legs, feeling as though she'd been flayed open and exposed. Ron immediately took her hand, squeezing tightly, and Harry leaned close to whisper, You did. Brilliantly. But Hermione didn't feel brilliant. She felt raw and exhausted and desperately sad. During the recess, her parents approached hesitantly, and for a long moment they all just stood there, looking at each other across a chasm of hurt and love and complicated forgiveness. Then, her mother pulled her into a fierce hug, and Hermione buried her face in her shoulder and cried like the child she'd been forced to stop being too soon. We understand, her mother whispered. We don't like it, and it still hurts, but we understand. You were trying to save us. I'm so sorry, Hermione sobbed. I'm so sorry. We know, sweetheart, her father said, his hand gentle on her back. We know. And outside the courtroom windows, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean, as though even the sky understood the need for tears and healing, and the slow, painful work of forgiveness. Ron couldn't sleep the night before his testimony. He lay in his childhood bedroom at the Burrow, staring at the Chudley Cannon's posters on the ceiling. The same posters that had been there since he was 11. The same room that had witnessed his entire journey from boy to man. But the room felt smaller now, as though he'd outgrown it, in ways that had nothing to do with physical size. George was in the room next door. Ron could hear him moving around occasionally, the creak of floorboards, the soft sounds of someone else unable to find peace in sleep. The twin bedroom, now occupied by one. Another reminder of the cost of the war, of all they had lost. And tomorrow, today, really, as the sky was beginning to lighten with the grey promise of dawn, Ron would have to stand before the Wizengamot and explain the worst thing he'd ever done, not fighting Death Eaters, Not facing Voldemort, but leaving, walking away from his best friends when they needed him most, abandoning them in a forest with Horcruxes to hunt and Death Eaters on their trail. The Horcrux had whispered such terrible things. They don't need you. They're better off without you. She loves him, not you. You're the spare, the extra, the one nobody wants. And Ron, exhausted and scared and wearing that bloody locket around his neck, had believed it. He'd let the darkness in, let it convince him that the worst version of himself was the true version, and he'd disapparated away into the night. He'd come back. He'd saved Harry's life, destroyed the Horcrux, earned his way back into their trust. But that didn't erase what he'd done. It didn't remove the shame that sat in his chest like a stone, cold and heavy and permanent. A soft knock at the door, and then his mother's voice. "Ron, dear, are you awake?" "Yeah, Mum." Molly entered, carrying a cup of tea and wearing her dressing gown, her hair in the same nighttime plait she'd worn for as long as Ron could remember. She sat on the edge of his bed, just as she had when he was small, and had nightmares about spiders or the Bloody Baron. "Drink this," she said gently, handing him the tea. "You need your strength." Ron sat up, accepting the cup. "Mum, what if they ask things I can't answer? What if I can't make them understand?" Molly's hand found his cheek, warm and calloused from years of magic and mothering. "Then you tell them the truth, sweetheart. You tell them you made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but that you came back. You faced your fear and your shame and you came back. That's what matters." "Fred didn't come back," Ron said quietly, the words he'd been thinking for months finally spoken aloud. "Fred died, and I wasn't there. I was off sulking in the forest like a child, and my brother—" "Stop," Molly said firmly, her eyes fierce. "Frederick Weasley died fighting Voldemort, defending Hogwarts, doing exactly what he chose to do. His death is not your fault. Ronald, do you hear me? It is not your fault." But Ron wasn't sure he believed that. He wasn't sure he'd ever believe it. The courtroom felt even more oppressive on the third day, as though the weight of testimony was accumulating in the air itself, making it harder to breathe. Ron walked to his seat with his head high, refusing to show the terror churning in his stomach. He'd faced giant spiders and Death Eaters and a bloody Horcrux. He could face this. Harry squeezed his shoulder as he passed, and Hermione's eyes were full of fierce support and love. His family filled 2 rows of the gallery. His parents, Bill and Fleur, Charlie, who had come from Romania, Percy, looking uncomfortable in formal robes, George, with dark circles under his eyes, and Ginny, who had insisted on being there despite Ron's protests. Only Fred was missing. Fred would always be missing. Tiberius Ogden called the session to order, and Ron felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Today, we will hear testimony from Mr. Ronald Bilious Weasley regarding his role in the Horcrux hunt, with particular focus on the period in autumn of 1997 when Mr. Weasley temporarily separated from his companions. Temporarily separated. What a polite way of saying abandoned. Ron stood and walked to the testimony stand, his long legs feeling unsteady. He gripped the edges of the podium to keep his hands from shaking, and faced the assembled Wizengamot with as much courage as he could gather. The sharp-featured wizard who had questioned Hermione so harshly stood immediately. "Mr. Weasley, let's begin with the events of late October 1997. You, Mr. Potter, and Miss Granger were camping in the Forest of Dean, searching for the Sword of Gryffindor, correct?" "Yes," Ron said, his voice steadier than he felt. "And you were taking turns wearing Slytherin's locket, one of the Horcruxes, because it was too dangerous for any one person to wear it continuously. Is that correct?" "Yes. The locket, it affected whoever was wearing it, made them angry, paranoid, brought out their worst thoughts." "And on the night of October 27th, whose turn was it to wear the locket?" Ron's jaw tightened. "Mine." "And what happened that night, Mr. Weasley?" This was it, the moment he'd been dreading. Ron took a deep breath and began. "We'd been on the run for months, moving every few days, never staying anywhere long enough to feel safe. We were hungry most of the time. Food was hard to come by, and we couldn't risk going into towns too often. We were cold. We were scared. And we had no idea if we were even looking in the right place for the next Horcrux." He paused, gathering himself. "I was wearing the locket that night, and it was like having poison poured into your mind. Every doubt you'd ever had, every insecurity, every fear, the locket found it and amplified it, made it seem true, made it seem real." Griselda Marchbanks leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Can you describe what the locket made you feel, Mr. Weasley?" Ron's hands clenched on the podium. This was the hard part, the shameful part. "It made me feel worthless," he said quietly. "Like I didn't matter. Like Harry and Hermione didn't really need me. They were just being nice by letting me come along. It whispered that they were better off without me, that I was holding them back." "And you believed it?" the sharp-featured wizard asked, his tone suggesting judgment. "Yes," Ron said, meeting his gaze directly. "I believed it, because part of me had always felt that way, even without the locket. I'm the sixth son in a family of achievers. My older brothers were all brilliant at something. Bill was head boy. Charlie played Quidditch for England. Percy was a Ministry rising star. Fred and George were genius inventors. And then there was me. Not particularly clever like Hermione, not famous like Harry, just ordinary Ron." He heard his mother make a sound of protest from the gallery, but he didn't look at her. He needed to say this, needed to get it all out. "So when the locket told me I wasn't wanted, I believed it. And when Harry and I had an argument, about nothing, really, about everything, I let my anger and my hurt and my fear control me, and I left." The courtroom was utterly silent. Even the scratching of quills had stopped. "You disapparated away and left Mr. Potter and Miss Granger alone in the forest," the sharp-featured wizard stated. "Left them to face Death Eaters, to continue the hunt without you, to potentially die without your protection." "Yes." The word came out raw and painful. "Why?" Marchbanks asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice, not judgment. "What did you think would happen after you left?" Ron looked down at his hands, remembering that terrible night with painful clarity. "I thought they'd be fine without me. Better, even. I thought Harry would keep Hermione safe, and they'd figure out the Horcrux hunt on their own, and I'd just go home, I suppose. Back to the burrow, back to safety." "But you didn't go home," Marchbanks observed. "No," Ron said quietly. "I tried to go back to them almost immediately. As soon as I'd disapparated away and the locket's influence started to fade, I realized what I'd done. I tried to find them again, but they'd already moved on. They'd put up protective enchantments I couldn't get through. I spent weeks searching for them." A witch from the fourth tier stood. elderly, with sharp eyes. Weeks, Mr. Weasley. You couldn't find them for weeks? 2 people you'd been travelling with for months? Ron felt heat rise in his cheeks. Hermione's protective enchantments were too good. She's brilliant at magic, always has been. And they were moving constantly, never staying in one place. I searched everywhere I could think of, everywhere we talked about going, but I couldn't find them. So what did you do during those weeks? The sharp-featured wizard asked. While your friends were alone and in danger. This was the part Ron had never told anyone, not even Hermione, not even Harry. He'd been too ashamed. I stayed at Shell Cottage for a while, he admitted, with Bill and Fleur. I told them I'd gotten separated from Harry and Hermione, that I was trying to find them again. Bill wanted to help me search, but I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't admit that I'd abandoned them. So you lied to your family, the wizard stated. Yes, I lied, and I felt like the biggest coward in the world, and every day that passed, I became more certain that something terrible had happened to them, and it was my fault. George's voice came from the gallery, rough with emotion. Ron! But Ron shook his head, not looking back. I listened to the radio constantly, to Potterwatch, hoping for news, hoping they were still alive, and I hated myself more with every day that passed. Marchbanks's expression had softened. But you did find them, eventually. Can you tell us about that? Ron felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders. This part was better. This part he could be proud of. I was carrying the Deluminator, the device Dumbledore had left me in his will. I'd never really understood what it was for, but one night when I was listening to Potterwatch, I heard Hermione's voice. Not on the radio, through the Deluminator. It was like it had captured her voice from somewhere, and it was calling me back to them. He paused, remembering the wonder and terror of that moment. I followed it. The Deluminator led me to them, to the Forest of Dean where they were camped. And I arrived just in time to see Harry jump into a frozen pool to retrieve the sword of Gryffindor. The sword that was necessary to destroy Horcruxes, Ogden clarified. Yes, Harry dove in wearing the locket, and it tried to strangle him, tried to drown him. I pulled him out, saved his life. Ron's voice was quiet, but steady. And then Harry asked me to destroy the locket, to use the sword to destroy the Horcrux. Why you? The elderly witch asked. Why not do it himself? Because the locket was mine to destroy, Ron said simply. It had gotten inside my head, had used my fears against me. Harry knew that I needed to face it, to prove to myself that I was stronger than the darkness it represented. And did you? Marchbanks asked gently. Destroy it? Yes, but not before it showed me visions. Terrible visions of my worst fears, Harry and Hermione together, telling me I wasn't wanted, that I'd never been wanted. Ron's voice shook slightly. It was the Horcrux's last attempt to break me, to make me too afraid to destroy it. But you overcame the fear, Ogden said, and it wasn't quite a question. I did. I stabbed it with the sword, and the Horcrux was destroyed. Ron met the Chief Warlock's eyes directly. And then I had to face Harry and Hermione, had to explain why I'd left, had to ask them to forgive me. And did they? The sharp-featured wizard asked, his tone suggesting he doubted it. For the first time since his testimony began, Ron allowed himself to look back at his friends. Harry was watching him with steady support, and Hermione's eyes were bright with tears, but also with fierce love. Eventually, Ron said quietly. Harry forgave me almost immediately, which I didn't deserve. Hermione took longer, which I did deserve. But she forgave me too, in time. He turned back to the Wizengamot. I know what I did was unforgivable. I know I failed them when they needed me most. I abandoned my best friends in the middle of a war, left them alone and vulnerable because I was jealous and insecure and wearing a piece of Voldemort's soul around my neck. Ron's voice grew stronger, more certain. But I also came back. I spent weeks searching for them, not knowing if they were alive or dead. I saved Harry's life. I destroyed a Horcrux, and I spent the rest of the war trying to prove that I deserved their trust again. Some would argue, the sharp-featured wizard said coldly, that your moment of weakness, your abandonment, could have resulted in the deaths of the only two people who knew how to destroy Voldemort, that your selfish choice could have cost us the war. Ron felt the truth of that accusation like a physical blow. Yes, he said quietly, it could have. And I live with that knowledge every day. Every single day I think about what might have happened if I hadn't found them again, if I hadn't been there to pull Harry from that pool, if the Horcrux hunt had failed because I was too weak to overcome my own insecurities. He paused, his hands gripping the podium so tightly his knuckles were white. But I also think about what did happen. I came back. We destroyed the Horcrux. We continued the hunt together. And we won. We defeated Voldemort, and we did it together. And yes, I'm ashamed of leaving, but I'm also proud that I found the strength to come back. Molly's voice rang out from the gallery, fierce and maternal. My son came back. He made a mistake, and he came back, and he fought, and he saved lives, and he helped end the war. Don't you dare diminish that. Ogden banged his gavel gently. Mrs. Weasley, please. Outbursts from the gallery are not permitted. But there was kindness in his voice, and when he looked at Ron, his expression had shifted into something like understanding. Mr. Weasley, he said quietly, this inquiry is not here to condemn you for being human. We are here to understand the full scope of what you three endured, the choices you made, and the consequences that followed. Your testimony has been illuminating. He consulted his notes. I have one more question, if you'll indulge me. You mentioned that the Deluminator led you back to your friends, that Professor Dumbledore's device somehow knew you would need it. Do you believe Dumbledore planned for your departure? That he anticipated you might leave and provided a way back? Ron had never really thought about it in those terms, but now, standing before the Wizengamot with months of hindsight, he considered it carefully. I think, he said slowly, that Dumbledore understood human nature better than anyone. He knew what the Horcruxes could do to people, how they could corrupt and twist. Maybe he didn't plan for me to leave specifically, but he understood that we were young, that we were carrying terrible burdens, that we might falter. And he gave me a way to find my way back when I did. Ron's voice grew softer, more reflective. Dumbledore believed in second chances. He believed that people could make mistakes and still be worthy of redemption. The Deluminator was his way of telling me that even if I failed, even if I fell, I could still choose to get back up and keep fighting. The courtroom was quiet, contemplative. Even the sharp-featured wizard seemed to have no more accusations to make. Thank you, Mr. Weasley, Ogden said finally. You may step down. We'll take a brief recess before, continuing with questions about the events following your return. Ron walked back to his seat, feeling lighter somehow, as though the confession had lifted some of the weight he'd been carrying. Hermione immediately took his hand, squeezing tightly, and Harry gripped his shoulder. "Proud of you, mate," Harry whispered. During the recess, George found him in the corridor outside the courtroom. For a long moment, the brothers just looked at each other, and Ron saw his own pain reflected in George's eyes. Different pain, deeper loss, but somehow shared. "You came back," George said quietly. "That's what Fred would have said, you know. That you made a mistake, but you came back. And that takes more courage than never leaving in the first place." Ron felt tears prick his eyes. "I wasn't there when it happened. I've always wondered if I could have." "Don't," George said firmly. "Don't do that to yourself. Fred died the way he lived, laughing and fighting, and being exactly who he chose to be. Nothing you could have done would have changed that. Nothing any of us could have done." He pulled Ron into a tight hug, and Ron let himself be held, let himself accept the forgiveness he wasn't sure he'd earned, but desperately needed. "We all falter," George whispered. "We all have moments we're not proud of. But you got back up, little brother. You got back up and kept fighting. That's what heroes do." And outside the ministry windows, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting golden light across the city, as though even the sky understood that confession and forgiveness were the beginning of healing. The fourth morning of the inquiry arrived with unexpected sunshine, bright and almost mocking in its cheerfulness. Hermione stood at her window, watching the light paint London in gold and amber, and thought about darkness. Specifically, she thought about the drawing room at Malfoy Manor, about cold marble floors and Bellatrix, Lestrange's knife, about screaming until her throat was raw, and knowing that the boys could hear her, but couldn't help. She hadn't wanted to testify about this, had begged Ogden privately to skip this part, to accept a written statement instead. But he had been kind and firm. The families deserved to hear what had happened, deserved to understand the cost of the war in human terms, not just statistics and casualty lists. And Dobby's name was on that memorial fountain. Dobby, who had died saving them, whose last words had been about friendship and freedom. His story deserved to be told, even if the telling hurt. Ron had stayed over the previous night, sleeping on her sofa, knowing, without being told, that she would need him close. When she emerged from her bedroom, dressed in simple grey robes, he was already awake, making tea with the careful precision of someone performing a comforting ritual. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, handing her a cup. "We can refuse. We can—" "No," Hermione interrupted gently. "We can't. This is part of the story, Ron. A terrible part. But it happened, and people need to know what the war really cost, what it really looked like." Ron's jaw tightened, and she saw the helpless rage that still lived in his eyes when he thought about Malfoy Manor, about what had been done to her while he was locked in a cellar, powerless to stop it. "I should have protected you," he said, his voice rough. "You did protect me," Hermione replied, taking his hand. "You came back for me. You all came back for me. That's what matters." But she knew, as they made their way to the ministry together, that some wounds never fully healed. Some memories stayed sharp and painful, no matter how much time passed. The courtroom felt heavier today, as though everyone present understood they were about to hear something difficult. Harry sat rigid in his seat, his hands clenched on the armrests. He had wanted to testify about Malfoy Manor himself, to spare Hermione the pain of recounting it, but She had insisted it was her story to tell. Tiberius Ogden's expression was grave as he called the session to order. Today, we will hear testimony regarding the events of March 1998, specifically the capture and imprisonment of Mr. Potter, Miss Granger, and Mr. Weasley at Malfoy Manor, and the subsequent escape that resulted in the death of the house elf Dobby. A ripple went through the courtroom. This was the testimony people had been waiting for, the dramatic escape, the daring rescue. But Hermione knew they had no idea what they were actually about to hear. She walked to the testimony stand with her head high, refusing to show the fear churning in her stomach. She had survived Bellatrix Lestrange. She could survive talking about it. Griselda Marchbanks stood, her elderly face showing deep compassion. Miss Granger, I know this testimony will be difficult. Please take your time and tell us what happened in your own words. Hermione took a deep breath, gathering herself. We were captured by snatchers in the Forest of Dean. We'd been staying at a cottage, and Harry had been recognized, despite the stinging jinx I'd used to disguise his face. The snatchers took us to Malfoy Manor. Why Malfoy Manor? A wizard from the third tier asked. Why not directly to the Ministry or to Voldemort himself? Because they weren't sure, Hermione explained. Harry's face was swollen, difficult to recognize clearly. They wanted confirmation before they claimed the reward for capturing him. And the Malfoys were known Death Eaters with direct access to Voldemort. She paused, remembering the fear of those first moments, being dragged through the gates, seeing the grand manor that had been transformed into something dark and terrible. We were brought into the drawing room. Lucius Malfoy was there, and Narcissa and Draco. They were trying to confirm Harry's identity when Bellatrix Lestrange arrived. Hermione's voice remained steady, clinical almost, as though she were reciting facts from a textbook rather than reliving trauma. Bellatrix saw the sword of Gryffindor that the Snatchers had taken from us. She became frantic, violent. The sword was supposed to be in her vault at Gringotts, you see. She needed to know how we'd gotten it, whether we'd been in her vault, what else we might have taken. And what happened then? Marchbanks asked gently. Hermione's hands tightened on the podium. She sent the others to the cellar. Harry, Ron, the other prisoners who were being held there. She kept me in the drawing room for questioning. The courtroom was utterly silent, waiting. She used the Cruciatus curse, Hermione said quietly. Multiple times. Between curses, she would ask questions. How did you get the sword? What else did you take? Were you in my vault? I told her we'd found the sword in the forest, that we hadn't been in her vault, but she didn't believe me. Ron made a sound like a wounded animal, and Hermione glanced back at him. His face was pale, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly they were shaking. The Cruciatus curse, Ogden said carefully, is one of the unforgivable curses, designed to cause maximum pain without physical injury. Can you describe what it felt like? For the first time, Hermione's composure cracked slightly. It felt like every nerve in my body was on fire, like being stabbed with 1,000 knives simultaneously from the inside. It's designed not just to hurt, but to break you, to make you willing to say anything, do anything, to make it stop. She paused, steadying herself. Between the curses, Bellatrix used other methods. She had a knife, a small silver knife that she was very proud of. She used it to reinforce her questions. Hermione pulled back her left sleeve, revealing the scar that would be there forever. The word mudblood carved into her forearm in Bellatrix's spidery handwriting. Several people in the gallery gasped. "She carved this while asking me questions," Hermione said, her voice distant now, detached. "She wanted to mark me," she said. "Wanted me to remember my place. Remember what I was." The sharp-featured wizard, who had been so critical before, stood slowly, and for once his expression showed no judgment, only horror. "Miss Granger, I must ask, did anyone try to stop this? The other Malfoys, surely." "Lucius left the room almost immediately," Hermione said. "He didn't want to watch." Narcissa stayed but said nothing. "Draco." She paused, remembering the boy's pale face, his evident discomfort. Draco looked like he wanted to leave, but didn't dare. They were all terrified of Bellatrix. "And how long did this interrogation last?" Marchbanks asked, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know exactly. It felt like hours, but it might have been less. Time becomes strange when you're in that much pain." Hermione's voice was steady again, but tears were sliding down her cheeks now, silent and unstoppable. "I could hear Ron screaming from the cellar. He could hear me, and he was trying to get out, trying to reach me. That was almost worse than the torture itself. Knowing he could hear me, knowing what it was doing to him." She looked at Ron again, saw the anguish on his face, and continued. "Eventually, I think I passed out. When I came to, Harry and Ron had escaped from the cellar with the help of Dobby the house elf. There was a fight. Wands were drawn, spells were cast. It was chaos." "Let's talk about Dobby," Ogden said carefully. "He was a house elf previously bound to the Malfoy family, correct?" "Yes. Harry had freed him years before, in our second year. But Dobby remembered, and he was loyal to Harry. When Harry called for him, he came, even though it meant returning to the house of his former masters." Hermione's voice grew softer, sadder. "Dobby helped us escape. He disapparated us away. Me, Harry, Ron, and several other prisoners, including Luna Lovegood, Mr. Ollivander the Wandmaker, and Griphook the Goblin. He took us to Shell Cottage, where Bill and Fleur lived." She paused, and everyone in the courtroom seemed to lean forward, knowing what was coming. "But as we were leaving, Bellatrix threw her knife, and it struck Dobby." The last words came out barely above a whisper. "He died in Harry's arms on the beach at Shell Cottage. His last words were, 'Harry Potter.' He died, saving us." The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of muffled crying from several members of the gallery. Even some of the Wizengamot members looked shaken. A witch from the fourth tier stood, her voice gentle. "Miss Granger, some have questioned whether Dobby's death could have been prevented. Whether, if you had sought help from the Order of the Phoenix or trained Aurors, this situation might never have occurred." Hermione felt a flash of anger cut through her grief. "We were captured by snatchers," she said sharply. "We didn't choose to go to Malfoy Manor. We didn't choose to be tortured. These things happened to us, and we survived them the only way we could." "But you were in the Forest of Dean in the first place because of the Horcrux hunt," the witch pressed. "If you had involved adults, if we had involved adults, more people would have died," Hermione interrupted, her voice hard now. "Do you think Bellatrix would have been kinder if there had been more of us? Do you think she would have stopped asking questions, stopped torturing, if we'd brought Aurors along?" She leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "The war was happening all around us. People were being captured and killed every day. We were trying to end it, trying to destroy the Horcruxes that made Voldemort immortal. Yes, terrible things happened. Yes, people died. But they died fighting, died free, died for something they believed in. Dobby died saving his friends. That was his choice. Marchbanks raised her hand for calm. Miss Granger, no one is suggesting that. You are responsible for Dobby's death. But this inquiry must examine whether the overall approach, the secrecy, the independence, led to preventable casualties. And I'm telling you, Hermione said, her voice shaking with emotion, that there were no perfect choices. Every option had costs. Every path led to death and pain. We chose the path we believed would end the war fastest, with the least overall suffering. Were we right? I don't know. I can't know. All I know is that we did our best with the information we had, and we paid for our choices in blood and nightmares and scars that will never fully fade. She held up her arm again, showing the carved word. This is my reminder of what the war really was. Not grand battles and heroic speeches, but torture and terror, and having to survive things no one should survive. And Dobby's death is my reminder of the cost, not just to us, but to everyone who helped us, everyone who believed in us, everyone who paid the price for our mission. Ron stood suddenly, unable to contain himself any longer. I was locked in a cellar, listening to her scream, he said, his voice rough with anguish. I was clawing at the walls, trying to break through, and I could hear Bellatrix laughing and Hermione screaming, and I couldn't do anything. Do you have any idea what that does to you? Do you have any idea what it's like to be that helpless? Harry stood too, placing a hand on Ron's shoulder, but addressing the Wizengamot. We were 17 and 18 years old, being hunted by the darkest wizards in history, carrying pieces of Voldemort's soul, watching people die, being tortured. We made mistakes. We made terrible, costly mistakes. But we also defeated Voldemort. We ended the war. And yes, it cost us. It cost us innocence and peace and people we loved. But what was the alternative? To let Voldemort win? To let more people die under his regime? Ogden banged his gavel gently, restoring order. Please, sit down. Both versus you. His voice was not unkind. This inquiry understands the emotional weight of these testimonies. We are not here to assign blame for the actions of Death Eaters. We are here to understand the full picture of what occurred. Harry and Ron sat reluctantly, and Hermione wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. Miss Granger, Ogden continued, I have one more question about Malfoy Manor. After the escape, after Dobby's death, did you seek medical attention for your injuries? Fleur helped me, Hermione said quietly. She had some training in healing. She treated my wounds, both from the knife and from the curses. But some wounds don't heal with magic. And yet, you continued the Horcrux hunt, Marchbanks observed. Within days of this trauma, you were back at work, planning the break-in to Gringotts. What else were we supposed to do? Hermione asked, genuinely confused by the question. Stop? Give up? Voldemort wasn't going to pause the war, because we'd been hurt. People were dying every day. We didn't have the luxury of taking time to recover. She paused, then added more softly. And perhaps, in some way, continuing the mission was how we recovered, how we took back power from what had been done to us. Bellatrix tried to break me, tried to make me feel worthless and powerless. The best revenge was to keep fighting, to keep working toward her defeat. a long silence fell over the courtroom. Hermione stood at the podium, tears drying on her cheeks, her scarred arm still partially visible, a living testament to the brutality of the war. Finally, Ogden spoke. "Miss Granger, your testimony has been profoundly moving. I think we all have a deeper understanding now of what you endured. You may step down. We'll take a longer recess. I believe we all need some time to process what we've heard." Hermione walked back to her seat on trembling legs. The moment she sat down, Ron pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, and she felt his chest heaving with silent sobs. Harry's hand found her shoulder, and the three of them sat there, connected by shared trauma and shared survival, while the courtroom slowly emptied around them. George appeared from the gallery, his eyes red. "Hermione," he said quietly, I never knew it was that bad." "Most people don't," she replied softly. "Most people only heard the heroic version, the daring escape, the brave rescue. They didn't hear about the screaming." "I'm sorry," George said, and he seemed to be apologizing for more than just not knowing. Apologizing, perhaps, for every time anyone had made their ordeal seem like an adventure, rather than the nightmare it was. "We survived," Hermione said, and it was both statement and prayer, affirmation and question. "We survived, and that has to mean something." In the empty courtroom, with sunshine streaming through the high windows, three young people sat together and remembered what it meant to survive the unsurvivable, to carry scars both visible and hidden, to live with memories that would never quite fade, but might, with time and love and the patient work of healing, become bearable. And outside, London continued its ordinary day, oblivious and peaceful, a city that would never fully understand what had been sacrificed in dark drawing rooms and cold cellars to keep it safe. The fifth morning arrived with a strange stillness, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Today would be the hardest testimony of all, the Battle of Hogwarts, the final confrontation, the deaths of so many. Harry stood before the mirror in Grimmauld Place, adjusting his robes with hands that trembled slightly, and thought about all the faces he would have to speak of today. Fred, Lupin, Tonks, Colin Creevey, Lavender Brown. 50 others whose names were carved into that memorial fountain, 50 families who would sit in the gallery today wanting answers he couldn't give. Could they have done it differently? Could more people have been saved? The questions that haunted his dreams were about to be asked aloud, officially, by people who had every right to demand answers. Ron and Hermione arrived together, as they had every morning of the inquiry, and presenting a united front. But today, they all looked worn, exhausted by the emotional toll of reliving their trauma day after day. Hermione's eyes were shadowed, and Ron's usual humour had been replaced by a grim determination to see this through. They travelled to the ministry in silence, each lost in their own memories of that terrible night when Hogwarts became a battlefield and childhood ended forever. The courtroom was more crowded than it had been on any previous day. The families of the fallen filled the gallery. Harry recognised Mrs. Creevey, Colin's mother, her face drawn and aged beyond her years. He saw Andromeda Tonks holding baby Teddy, the infant who would never know his parents. The Weasleys occupied their usual seats, but today Molly's face was set in lines of steel, preparing to hear about the death of her son. Tiberius Ogden's voice was solemn as he called the session to order. Today we address the events of May 2nd, 1998, the Battle of Hogwarts. This will be the most difficult testimony of all, and I ask for patience and compassion from everyone present. We will hear from all three witnesses about the battle, the decisions made, and the consequences that followed." He paused, his old eyes sweeping the courtroom. "Let us remember that we are here not to assign blame for deaths caused by Voldemort and his followers, but to understand whether different choices might have led to different outcomes." Harry stood and walked to the testimony stand, feeling the weight of every eye upon him. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading since the inquiry began. "Mr. Potter," Ogden began gently, "please tell us how the Battle of Hogwarts began." Harry took a deep breath. "We had returned to Hogwarts searching for the last Horcrux, Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem. We believed it was hidden somewhere in the castle. When we arrived, the school was under the control of Severus Snape, who had been appointed headmaster after Dumbledore's death." "And you revealed your presence there?" Griselda Marchbanks asked. "Yes. There was a confrontation with Snape, and he fled. Then Professor McGonagall began organizing the defense of the castle, because we all knew, that Voldemort would come. He would sense that we were searching for his Horcruxes, and he would bring his army." "Did you request that students be evacuated before the battle began?" a witch from the third tier asked. "Yes," Harry said firmly. "McGonagall ordered all students under 17 to leave immediately. Those of age were given the choice to stay and fight, or to leave. Many chose to stay." "Including Colin Creevey." Mrs. Creevey's voice came from the gallery, breaking with emotion. "My son was only 16. He wasn't supposed to be there." Harry turned to face her, his green eyes full of anguish. "Colin sneaked back," he said quietly. "He was supposed to leave with the younger students, but he returned. I didn't know he was there until after." "Did you encourage students to fight?" the sharp-featured wizard asked. "Did you ask them to risk their lives?" "No," Harry said, his voice hard. "I never wanted anyone to fight for me. I never wanted anyone to die for me. But Voldemort was attacking Hogwarts. People chose to defend their school, their home, their world. I couldn't have stopped them, even if I'd tried." Ron stood suddenly from his seat. "They didn't fight for Harry," he said, his voice carrying through the courtroom. "They fought because Voldemort was evil, because he was murdering innocent people, because someone had to stand against him. Harry didn't ask for any of it." "Mr. Weasley, please sit down," Ogden said, not unkindly. "You'll have your chance to testify." Ron sat reluctantly, and Harry continued. "The battle began when Voldemort's forces attacked the protective enchantments around the castle. Death Eaters, giants, acromantulas, dementors. He brought everything he had. The teachers and order members had set up defences, but they could only hold for so long." "And where were you during the battle?" Marchbanks asked. "Searching for the diadem. Ron, Hermione, and I were trying to find and destroy the last Horcrux while the battle raged around us. We went to the Room of Requirement, where we believed the diadem was hidden." Harry paused, remembering that terrible room filled with mountains of hidden objects, fiendfire raging out of control. "We encountered Draco Malfoy, Gregory Goyle, and Vincent Crabbe there. Crabbe cast fiendfire, cursed fire that destroys everything, even Horcruxes, but he lost control of it. The entire room became an inferno." "And what happened to Crabbe?" Ogden asked quietly. "He died," Harry said, his voice heavy, "consumed by his own fire. We tried to save him. We flew out on broomsticks and tried to reach him, but the fire was too fast, too powerful. We barely escaped ourselves. A woman in the gallery made a sound of grief. Crab's mother, Harry realized. Another life lost, another family destroyed. But the Horcrux was destroyed, the bureaucratic wizard stated. Vincent Crabbe died, but the mission succeeded. Harry felt anger flash through him. Vincent Crabbe died because he cast a curse he couldn't control, trying to kill us. His death wasn't part of any plan. It was a tragedy, and I wish we could have saved him. But I won't apologize for surviving when he tried to murder us. Silence fell over the courtroom, heavy with judgment and grief in equal measure. "Let's move forward," Ogden said carefully. "What happened after you destroyed the Horcrux?" This was the part Harry had been dreading most. "I went into Voldemort's mind, through the connection we shared, and saw that he was in the Shrieking Shack with Nagini, his snake, the last Horcrux. I knew we had to go there, had to destroy Nagini to make Voldemort mortal." "You went to confront Voldemort directly?" Marchbanks asked, concern in her voice. "Not to confront him, to observe, to find a way to kill the snake. But when we arrived..." Harry's voice caught. "When we arrived, we witnessed him murder Severus Snape." A ripple went through the courtroom. Snape's true loyalty was known now, but the complexity of his role still caused controversy. Voldemort believed Snape was the true master of the Elder Wand, the wand Voldemort had taken from Dumbledore's tomb. He killed Snape to gain mastery of the wand. Harry's voice was soft now, reflective. "Snape died giving me his memories, showing me the truth about everything. His love for my mother, his role as a double agent, his protection of me throughout my years at Hogwarts." "And those memories revealed something else," Ogden said quietly. "Something about you, Mr. Potter." Harry nodded slowly. "They revealed that I was Horcrux, that when Voldemort tried to kill me as a baby, he accidentally made me into his 7th Horcrux. That I carried a piece of his soul inside me, and that as long as I lived, Voldemort couldn't truly die." The courtroom erupted in noise, gasps, exclamations, the frantic scratching of quills. Even though this information had been made public months ago, hearing Harry confirm it himself seemed to strike people anew. "So you walked into the Forbidden Forest," Marchbanks said, her voice thick with emotion, "knowing that Voldemort had to kill you." "Yes." The word was simple, final. "I walked into the forest, found Voldemort, and let him cast the killing curse. I died, or the part of his soul inside me died, and I found myself in a place like King's Cross Station, where I spoke with Dumbledore, or a version of him. He told me I could go back, could return to life, because Voldemort had used my blood to resurrect himself years before. That blood connection tethered me to life as long as he lived." "So you came back," Ogden said. "And then?" "Then I pretended to be dead. Narcissa Malfoy checked me and lied to Voldemort, told him I was gone. He had Hagrid carry my body back to the castle as a trophy to demoralize the defenders." Harry's voice hardened. He thought he'd won. He offered everyone a chance to surrender, to join him. "And did anyone?" the sharp-featured wizard asked. "No." Neville Longbottom refused him to his face, and when Voldemort tried to curse Neville, I revealed that I was alive. The final battle began. Ron stepped forward to the testimony stand as Harry sat down, their testimony blending together as it had during the battle itself, two parts of the same story. "The fighting was chaos," Ron said, his voice steady, but his eyes haunted. Death Eaters everywhere, curses flying, people falling. I was with Hermione, trying to get to the Great Hall, trying to help wherever we could. We destroyed Nagini. Neville killed the snake with Gryffindor's sword, which made Voldemort mortal finally. He paused, his hands gripping the podium. That's when I saw Fred. He was dueling Augustus Rookwood, fighting alongside Percy. He was laughing. Fred was always laughing, even in the middle of a battle. And then there was an explosion. The wall collapsed. When the dust cleared, Fred was... Ron's voice broke, and he couldn't continue. Molly's sob from the gallery was audible to everyone. Hermione stood and walked to stand beside Ron, her hand finding his. Fred died instantly, she said quietly, taking over when Ron couldn't speak. The explosion killed him and several others nearby. There was nothing anyone could have done. The battle was happening too fast, too chaotically. People were dying all around us. Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks fell in the Great Hall, Harry added, his voice rough. Fighting Death Eaters, protecting students. Lavender Brown was attacked by Fenrir Greyback on the stairs. Colin Creevey fell on the grounds. We found his body later, his camera still around his neck. Mrs. Creevey was weeping openly now, and others in the gallery had joined her. The families of the fallen mourning anew as they heard the details of how their loved ones had died. 50 people died that night, Hermione said, her voice stronger now, carrying through the courtroom. 50 people who chose to fight, who chose to stand against Voldemort, even knowing the cost. Were their deaths preventable? Perhaps some of them. If we'd found the Horcruxes faster, if we'd involved more people, if we'd made different choices along the way, maybe fewer would have died. She paused, her eyes blazing with fierce conviction. But maybe more would have. Maybe if we'd waited, if we'd tried to plan more carefully, Voldemort would have grown stronger, killed more people, caused more suffering. We made the choices we thought were right with the information we had. And yes, people died. People we loved. People we would give anything to bring back. But Voldemort died too. His regime ended. The war was won. A man stood from the gallery. Harry recognized him as Lavender Brown's father. My daughter was 20 years old, he said, his voice shaking. She survived 6 years of war, survived everything Voldemort threw at the world, and she died in a castle that should have been safe, fighting a battle she shouldn't have had to fight. How is that victory? Harry stood, facing the man directly. It's not, he said quietly. Your daughter's death isn't a victory. Fred Weasley's death isn't a victory. None of the deaths are victories. They're tragedies, and they always will be. But the end of Voldemort's reign is a victory. The fact that no more children will grow up in a world where Muggleborns are hunted and murdered is a victory. The fact that we're sitting here today, alive and free to ask these questions, that's a victory, even if it came at a terrible price. He paused, his green eyes holding Lavender's, father's gaze. Your daughter was brave. She chose to fight when she could have run. She died protecting younger students from Fenrir Greyback. I can't give her back to you, and I can't make her death mean something it doesn't. But I can tell you that she mattered, that her choice mattered, and that the world she helped save will remember her. The man sat down slowly, tears streaming down his face, and Harry felt his own eyes burning. Andromeda Tonks stood, holding baby Teddy in her arms. My daughter and my son-in-law died that night, she said, her voice steady, despite the grief etched into every line of her face. They left behind this child, an orphan before he was even a year old. I need to know. Could they have been saved? If you three had asked for help sooner, if the Order had known about the Horcruxes, could Remus and Dora still be alive? The question hung in the air like a curse, and Harry felt the weight of it crushing down on him. Teddy, his godson, orphaned as Harry, himself had been orphaned, another generation marked by loss. I don't know, Harry said honestly, his voice breaking. I think about that every time I see Teddy. I wonder if different choices would have saved them, saved Fred, saved all of them. But I also know that Remus and Tonks chose to fight. They were experienced fighters, trained Aurors and Order members. They knew the risks better than we did. And they fought anyway, because they believed in the cause, because they wanted their son to grow up in a better world. He paused, gathering himself. I'm Teddy's godfather. I look at him and I see my own story. Parents who died fighting Voldemort, a child left behind, and I promise you, I promise him that their sacrifice won't be forgotten, that we'll build the world they died for, a world worthy of what they gave. Andromeda nodded slowly, tears sliding down her cheeks, and sat back down with Teddy clutched against her chest. Ogden raised his hand for silence as the courtroom buzzed with emotion. I think, he said quietly, that we've heard enough testimony about the battle itself. The final question this inquiry must address is this. Given all that we now know, given all that happened, was the approach taken by these three young people the right one? He looked at Harry, Ron, and Hermione standing together at the testimony stand. You hunted Horcruxes in secret. You faced dangers alone that trained adults might have struggled with. You made choices that led, directly or indirectly, to deaths and suffering. But you also defeated Voldemort. You ended the war. The Wizengamot must now decide, were your methods justified by the outcome, or did your youth and inexperience lead to preventable tragedies? The courtroom fell silent, waiting. Harry looked at his friends, at Ron and Hermione, who had stood beside him through everything, and then turned back to the Wizengamot. We were children, he said quietly. We were scared and exhausted, and making decisions one our age should have to make. We made mistakes, terrible mistakes. We got people killed. We crossed lines we can never uncross. But we also did what we believed Dumbledore wanted us to do. We followed the path he set us on, and we saw it through to the end. He paused, his voice growing stronger. Could adults have done it better? Maybe. Could more careful planning have saved lives? Possibly. But we didn't have the luxury of time or perfect information. We had a mission, and we had each other. And we did the best we could. If that wasn't good enough, if our best led to deaths that could have been prevented, then we'll carry that guilt for the rest of our lives. But we won't apologize for trying. We won't apologize for fighting. And we won't apologize for surviving. Ron and Hermione stood on either side of him, and together they faced the judgment of the wizarding world. Three young people who had saved everything and lost so much, waiting to hear whether their sacrifice had been enough. The sixth morning dawned grey and quiet. London wrapped in a soft mist that made the world feel hushed and contemplative. Harry woke early in Grimmauld Place, unable to sleep past dawn, and found himself wandering through the old house's rooms as though saying goodbye to something, though he wasn't quite sure what. Today, the Wizengamot would deliberate. Today they would deliver their verdict. Not guilty or innocent, for this wasn't a criminal trial, but Something perhaps more important. Their judgment on whether three young people had done right or wrong when faced with impossible choices. Ron and Hermione arrived together as the sun was beginning to burn through the mist, and the three of them sat in the kitchen sharing tea and silence. There was nothing left to say. They had laid bare every truth, confessed every mistake, defended every choice. Now they could only wait. "Whatever they decide," Hermione said quietly, her hands wrapped around her teacup, "we know the truth. We know we did our best." "Do we, though?" Ron asked, staring into his tea as though it held answers. "I've been thinking about Fred every night, about whether he'd still be here if we'd done things differently." Harry reached across the table and gripped Ron's shoulder. "Fred would tell you to stop being a prat," he said gently. "He'd tell you that he made his own choices and that he wouldn't change them even if he could." "How do you know?" Ron's voice was rough with unshed tears. "Because I knew Fred," Harry replied simply. "And so did you." The courtroom was packed to capacity for the final day, but the atmosphere felt different, less hostile, more contemplative. 5 days of testimony had changed something, had shifted the narrative from simple judgment to complex understanding. People had heard the truth now, all of it, the heroism and the mistakes, the victories and the losses. The Wizengamot filed in, their plum-coloured robes rustling in the silence. Tiberius Ogden took his seat as chief warlock, and his expression was thoughtful, grave, but not unkind. "This inquiry has heard 5 days of testimony," he began, his voice filling the courtroom. "We have examined the choices made by Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Ronald Weasley during the Second Wizarding War, particularly during their hunt for Lord Voldemort's Horcruxes. We have heard from the accused, though they are not accused of crimes, and from witnesses, experts, and the families of those who fell." He paused, letting his words settle over the assembled crowd. "The Wizengamot has deliberated through the night. We have consulted historical records, magical theory, war protocols, and our own consciences. What we have concluded is this. There are no simple answers to the questions this inquiry was meant to address." A murmur ran through the courtroom, and Ogden raised his hand for silence. Could the Horcrux hunt have been conducted differently? Perhaps. Could more experienced wizards have been involved? Possibly. Could lives have been saved if different choices had been made? We cannot know. What we do know is this. 3 young people, barely of age, took on a burden that should never have fallen to them. They faced darkness and danger with courage and determination. They made mistakes, as all humans do. They caused pain, both to themselves and others. But they also ended a war that had claimed countless lives and threatened to destroy our entire society. Griselda Marchbank stood, and her elderly voice was firm and clear. "I have examined the evidence of the Horcruxes, their nature, their protection, their effect on those who carried them. What these 3 endured, carrying pieces of Voldemort's soul, exposing themselves to dark magic of the deepest kind. It would have broken most adults. That they survived it, that they maintained their humanity and their moral compass, is extraordinary." The bureaucratic wizard who had been so critical stood next. "I have been harsh in my questioning," he admitted, "because I believed these 3 had been reckless, had prioritized glory over safety. But I have listened to their testimony, and I have heard something I did not expect. Not pride, but humility. not justification, but genuine remorse for lives lost. They have not claimed to be heroes. They have claimed only to have done their best in circumstances no one should face. One by one, members of the Wizengamot stood and spoke. Some praised the trio's courage. Others questioned specific decisions. But a consensus emerged, slow and tentative, but growing stronger. These three had been placed in an impossible situation, and they had navigated it as well as anyone could have expected. Finally, Ogden stood again. The Wizengamot has reached its conclusions, which I will now read into the record. The courtroom fell silent, everyone leaning forward. First, regarding the secrecy of the Horcrux hunt, we find that while the decision to keep the mission secret was fraught with risk, it was consistent with the instructions left by Albus Dumbledore, and reasonable given the danger of Voldemort learning of the hunt. We cannot definitively say that involving more people would have led to better outcomes. Harry felt something in his chest loosen slightly. Second, regarding the use of questionable magic, including unforgivable curses and memory modification, we acknowledge that war creates ethical dilemmas where all choices are compromised. Miss Granger's modification of her parents' memories, while ethically troubling, was done to protect their lives and has since been reversed. The use of Imperius and Cruciatus curses during the war, while technically illegal, occurred in life-or-death situations. Given the extraordinary circumstances, we do not recommend prosecution. Hermione's hand found Ron's beneath the table, squeezing tightly. Third, regarding Mr. Weasley's temporary abandonment of the mission, we find that this action, while regrettable, was the result of dark magic's influence combined with the stress of an impossible situation. Mr. Weasley's return, his subsequent actions, and his evident remorse demonstrate character and growth. We see no reason for official censure. Ron's shoulders sagged with relief, and Harry saw tears sliding down his friend's face. Fourth, regarding the Battle of Hogwarts and the deaths that occurred, we find that the three individuals before us didn't cause these deaths. Lord Voldemort and his followers bear sole responsibility for the casualties of war. While we acknowledge that different choices might have led to different outcomes, we cannot and will not hold three young people responsible for deaths caused by evil they worked to stop. In the gallery, Molly Weasley was weeping, and Arthur had his arm around her. Andromeda Tonks held baby Teddy close, her eyes closed. Mrs. Creevey dabbed at her tears with a handkerchief, and Lavender Brown's father sat with his head bowed. "Finally," Ogden said, his voice growing softer. This inquiry was called to provide answers and closure. What we have found instead is that some questions have no satisfactory answers. War is chaos. Teenagers should not have to hunt Horcruxes. People die who should not die, and the world is diminished by their loss. But in the midst of that chaos, three people did their best to end the darkness. They suffered for it. They sacrificed for it. They will carry the scars, physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives. He paused, looking directly at Harry, Ron, and Hermione. The Wizengamot's official finding is this: Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Ronald Weasley acted with courage, determination, and reasonable judgment given their age, experience, and the extraordinary circumstances they faced. While we acknowledge that mistakes were made and lives were lost, we find no evidence of recklessness, malice, or negligence. We commend them for their service to the wizarding world, and recommend that they be allowed to move forward with their lives without further official scrutiny. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, someone in the gallery began to clap. It was Arthur Weasley, standing with tears on his face, applauding his son and his son's friends. Molly joined him, and then George, and then others. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to matter. Harry felt something break inside him, some dam he'd been holding in place for months, and he found himself crying. Not quietly, but with great heaving sobs that shook his whole body. Ron's arm came around his shoulders, and Hermione was there too, and the three of them stood together as the courtroom erupted in noise around them, some applauding, some protesting, some simply crying for all that had been lost and all that remained. The aftermath of the verdict unfolded slowly over the following weeks. The Daily Prophet ran dozens of articles, some supportive, some critical, some simply trying to make sense of everything they'd heard. Rita Skeeter published a sensationalized account that Harry refused to read. Other reporters were more thoughtful, more honest in their coverage. But what mattered more than the articles were the personal moments that followed. Mrs. Creevey found Harry in Diagon Alley one afternoon and pulled him into a tearful hug. "Thank you for remembering him," she whispered. "Thank you for saying his name." Lavender Brown's father sent a letter, not forgiving exactly, but acknowledging, understanding, perhaps, that blame offered no comfort, that his daughter had made her own choice. Andromeda brought Teddy to visit, and Harry held his godson and made promises he intended to keep about being there, about making sure Teddy knew who his parents had been, what they'd died for. And George found Ron one evening at the Burrow and said simply, "Fred would be proud of you. He'd tell you to stop moping and get on with living." "How do you know?" Ron asked, echoing his earlier question to Harry. "Because I'm half of Fred," George replied, "and I'm telling you, so listen." 3 months after the inquiry ended, on a cool November evening, Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat together in the kitchen at Grimmauld Place. They had fallen into the habit of these quiet evenings together, processing everything that had happened, slowly finding their way back to something like normalcy. "I've been thinking," Hermione said quietly, "about what we do now. We spent so long being defined by the war, by the hunt, by being symbols. I don't know how to just be Hermione, just a person." "I know what you mean," Harry said. "People still stare at me in the street, still want me to be the boy who lived, the chosen one. I'm tired of being chosen. I want to choose for myself." Ron looked at both of them, his expression thoughtful. "Then let's choose," he said simply. "Let's choose what comes next. Not because anyone expects it, or because it's our destiny, but because it's what we want." "What do you want?" Hermione asked softly. Ron was quiet for a moment, considering. "I want a quiet life, a normal life. I want to work at the joke shop with George, help him rebuild. I want to make people laugh instead of making them afraid. And I want—" He looked at Hermione, his ears going red. "I want you, if you'll have me, not as a war companion or a mission partner, but as whatever we can be when we're not running for our lives." Hermione's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it. Though I also want to go back to Hogwarts, finish my education properly, take my NE duties, maybe work on magical law reform, help prevent future wars." "Of course you do," Ron said fondly, pulling her close. "You wouldn't be you if you weren't planning to change the world." Harry watched them, feeling a bittersweet mix of joy and loneliness. "I think," he said slowly, "I want to be an Auror. Actually fight dark wizards properly, with training and backup and legal authority. Make sure what happened with Voldemort never happens again." "That's very noble," Hermione said warmly. "It's also terrifying," Harry admitted, "choosing to walk toward danger instead of having it forced on me. But it feels right. It feels like my choice." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, three friends who had been through hell together and emerged scarred, but whole on the other side. "The inquiry was awful," Ron said eventually. "Reliving all of it, defending our choices, watching families cry. But maybe it was necessary. Maybe we needed to face all of it, speak it out loud before we could move on." "Closure," Hermione murmured. "Not perfect, but real." "And we don't have to be symbols anymore," Harry added. "The inquiry examined us, judged us, and found us human, flawed, and trying and doing our best. I can live with that." "We all can," Ron agreed. Outside the kitchen window, London sparkled with evening lights, ordinary and peaceful and alive. Inside Grimmauld Place, three young people sat together and planned futures instead of missions, talked about dreams instead of Horcruxes, and slowly, carefully, learned to be themselves instead of heroes. The war was over. The inquiry was over. The judgment had been passed. Now came the harder work, learning to live with what they'd done, who they'd become, and who they wanted to be. Learning to forgive themselves for being human. Learning that survival was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new one. Years later, when people asked about the inquiry, Ron and Hermione would speak of it thoughtfully, honestly, as a difficult but necessary reckoning. They built a life together, Ron helping George rebuild Weasley's Wizard Wheezes into something even more successful than before. Hermione finishing Hogwarts and going on to revolutionize magical law, protecting the rights of house elves and other magical creatures. Harry became an Auror, as he'd planned, and eventually head of the Auror office. He married Ginny Weasley and named his children after those who'd fallen: Lily, James, Albus Severus. He made sure Teddy Lupin knew his parents' story, made sure all the children of the war understood what had been sacrificed for their peace. The inquiry became part of history, a footnote in the larger story of Voldemort's defeat, but an important one. It reminded the wizarding world that heroes were human, that victory came with costs, that judgment should be tempered with compassion. And on quiet evenings, when the three friends gathered together, older now, with children of their own, they would sometimes talk about those 5 days in the courtroom, about the questions that had no good answers, about the families who had needed to hear the truth, even when the truth offered no comfort. "We did our best," Hermione would say, and it was both statement and question, affirmation and prayer. "We survived," Ron would add, "and that has to mean something." And Harry, looking at his friends and their families and the peaceful world they'd helped create, would nod and say simply, "We chose to keep living. That's what matters. We chose life over guilt, hope over shame, future over past, and we made it work." They had been tried by war and by judgment, by loss and by public scrutiny, and they had emerged not unscathed. The scars were still there, would always be there, but whole, human, forgiven, if not by everyone, then by themselves, which was perhaps the most important verdict of all. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our story. Let it settle over you like a soft blanket as you drift toward sleep. Let the questions fade. Let the judgment pass. Let the memory of 3 young people facing impossible choices carry you gently into dreams. Remember that we are all, in our way, on trial. By ourselves, by others, by the consequences of our choices. Remember that perfection is impossible, but trying is enough. Remember that survival and growth, and choosing to keep living in the face of loss, these are victories too. Close your eyes now and rest. Let the weight of this story slip away as you breathe deeply, slowly, peacefully. Tomorrow is a new day, full of choices yet to be made and futures yet to unfold. But tonight, simply rest, simply be, simply allow yourself the grace of imperfection and the comfort of knowing that doing your best, even when your best is flawed, is all anyone can ask. Sleep well, dear listener. Sleep peacefully. And may you wake to a world where judgment is tempered with compassion, where mistakes are met with understanding, and where every ending opens the door to new beginnings. Good night.